and 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Loa Boots. Start your day off on the right foot with footwear that was designed for those who stand relentlessly in the face of adversity. I wear Loa every single day, for miles on canine searches and for hours on tactical operations in inclement weather. No matter what, Loa keeps me moving. Whether you run, hike, hunt, or fight, on the streets or out in the woods, Loa has the gear you need to help you conquer whatever challenges you face. Go check out their new line of trail running shoes at Loa Boots, L-O-W-A Boots.com, and get outside for some fresh air and daylight. Loa, for those who know where they're going and won't stop until they get there.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching. And you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com.
All right, so a little while ago, we did a talk about strategy. And one of the things that we talked about in that discussion, just as an example, was about tubular assaults. This is a law enforcement and militaryism that has to do with things like buses and trains and airliners, where if you think about like a hostage rescue that occurs in not a typical building, but in a tube.
Inside a tube.
Imagine that,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
In a tube, right? Which is its own kind of room. It changes the dynamic quite a bit. And I mentioned in there that this is a very unique problem that we have to train and prepare for, but it's not something that we see very often. I kind of made a joke about how, all 5 that have happened in the last 30 years or whatever. And I'm speaking in hyperbole, obviously, but it's
not by much.
Not by a lot, right?
Yeah.
But it's not something that comes up every day, but it is something that requires its own due attention, right? And its own training and problem solving and all of that. Well, where that discussion kind of comes up is learning how to do that, and sort of the requirement to learn how to do that didn't come in a vacuum, right? If you are as old as me and Jim, which is pretty old at this point, you probably remember a bunch of movies when you were a kid, like pre 9/11, about planes getting hijacked. That was like a thing in like the 70s, 80s, early 90s. Pre 9/11, like planes getting hijacked. And not only was that a thing, but it was a thing that they did a lot of movies about, right? So one of those,
just to be clear, they did a lot of movies about it because it was happening a lot, right? It just to...
And for that reason, it was easy to kind of like romanticize about, right? And so like law enforcement agencies across the country were like, oh my gosh, what if? So they started thinking about like, how would we handle this sort of thing? And that's a good discussion to have. It's a niche topic. It's not something that you're going to deal with every day, but it is something that you should have probably thought about prior to the day that it happens.
And it looks cool in videos and photos on social media. And so often when you see SWAT training or the FBI hostage rescue team training, what are they doing? They're doing one of these tubular assaults. They're assaulting a bus or a plane or whatever, right? So often the image that we have of hostage rescue comes from this, even if many hostage rescue events don't actually happen in tubes.
And therein lies kind of the rub, right? Is it's easy to make look really cool, but the reality is this is actually a really, really difficult problem. And it's kind of like we joked in that episode, and we'll joke here, like the problem with fighting in a basement is you're fighting in a basement. Well, the problem with fighting in a tube is you're fighting in a tube, right? This is not an easy thing to deal with. Like if you think that hijackers on an airliner, like assaulting that is going to be straightforward, you're mistaken, right? So that didn't come in a vacuum. There were several events of that kind of thing occurring, right? And one of those examples that has sort of shaped hostage rescue scenarios in domestic law enforcement in the United States for basically ever since was highlighted in a court case called Downs versus the United States. This was an incident that happened in 1971. The court case was decided in 1975.
And that was the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals for the United States courts, right? So to be clear, this is a circuit court case, not a Supreme Court case. The Sixth Circuit geographically is the region of federal courts that make up like Tennessee and Kentucky and Ohio and Michigan. And this event started in Tennessee and it ended in Florida. But it was heard, the suit was heard in the Sixth Circuit. I want to be clear, this is not the Supreme Court case called Downs.
Another
that decision,
Downs versus United States.
Yeah. That decision involves taxes on sugar from 1903, because why not? To the sugar industry, I'm sure it's very important, but it's not what we're talking about, right? It involves a lot less shooting hostage takers and shooting the wheels out of a plane and that kind of thing. So, to set the scene here, the 1970s, that was before even I was alive, so it's been a minute since the 70s, and many of our listeners probably also weren't alive in the 70s. Some of you might have been. If you were, it's time to schedule your colonoscopy and all that. So,
Yeah.
What you need to understand in the 70s was little showy, and by little I mean low consequence, relatively speaking. Aircraft and bus hijackings were a lot more common then. So these weren't like 9/11, where the world stopped because this happened. They got a lot of press, but very often the hostages ended up surviving. The aircraft ended up being recovered. Every once in a while, the hostages, for example, would be like taken off the plane and they'd blow up the plane. But it was happening actually quite a bit. And unlike the 9/11 hijacking crew, you had a wide spectrum of hijacker personalities, methods, motivations. You had some very sophisticated ones, and you had just some crazies.
It wasn't just an organized attack that just was a coordinated thing. This was just another medium that people were capitalizing on at the time.
And when we think about how violence and mass violence has evolved, crazies back then would maybe hijack an airliner, whereas crazies now shoot up a school. And it's important to understand how that evolved and why that evolved, and what became the harder target over time. And maybe there was some strategy that maybe we should have had to make sure schools didn't become that hard target.
There's a lot wrapped up in that.
Oh, yeah. So early 70s, hijackings, airliners, you had several. There was the Southern Airways Flight 49 that was hijacked to Havana, Cuba. There was the TWA Flight 106 hijacked to Havana, Cuba. In fact, according to Wikipedia, there were 36 hijackings or attempts just to go to Cuba in the 70s. Could you imagine, if in the last decade we had 36 hijackings? Let alone if those were just the ones to go to Cuba. I don't know what was going on in Cuba. Apparently it was a very happening place in the mid-70s. I don't know. And on the response side, you didn't have a really developed tactical assault capability in law enforcement. This is a new problem set, right? And you similarly didn't have it in the military really either. LAPD SWAT was one of the first SWAT teams in the country. It wasn't full-time until 1971. The FBI's hostage rescue team didn't exist as the HRT until 1983. The military has always had some kind of an assault force. In the 70s, there was a blue light project that was a prototype. The Army high-end hostage rescue capability didn't go operational until 1978. So you had this growing threat on the hijacking side, and you had this nascent baby capability to handle it on the law enforcement military side. So this case, the Downs case, and I took this from the court decision of the Downs case, starts with the hijacking of a small passenger airplane. So I don't know actually which one it was, but
It was like a charter plane,
think like a private plane, right?
but one that like you would hire to take you somewhere, not just like a casual private pilot kind of thing, but like one that you would hire you to take you somewhere if you were a baller.
Yeah, I picture like a King Air type
something
plane.
like that. Yeah.
Small passenger airplane from Nashville, Tennessee. Inside the aircraft, there was a hijacker, an associate, the hijacker's estranged wife, a pilot, and also a co-pilot. The hijacker ordered the aircraft flown to Freeport, which is a town in the Bahamas, and they had to stop for gas in Jacksonville, Florida.
Yeah, so to break that down just a little bit further, the original hijacker, the main suspect in this case, hired this plane to go take them from point A to point B. And when he tried to do so, him, his buddy, and his estranged wife went to go board the plane that morning. And the wife was absolutely hysterical, and clearly things were not okay. And so the captain and co-pilot of this chartered aircraft were like, what's going on? I don't really feel great about this. Like, why is this girl all crying and upset? And so dude pulls a gun and is like, get on the aircraft. We're going. And that's kind of how this thing starts.
It was the 70s.
Yeah, you know. It's a Thursday or whatever, day that ends in Y, I'm sure.
Yeah. So they're mid-hijacking, and they land in Jacksonville, Florida to get some gas.
Oh, right. Because the intent was when they hired the plane, it was going, I don't remember where it was going, but that was not the intent, right? But at the point that the gun gets pulled, they're like, hey, we're going to the Bahamas. And the guy's like, well, we don't have the gas for that. And we're like, we're going anyway. And so we need to stop in Florida for gas. That's
a long swim. Yeah. At some point, the law enforcement finds out about this. FBI's respond to Jacksonville, to the airport, and they refuse to allow refueling. And despite the fact the pilot was kind of signaling the hijacker was armed, he was dangerous, and that, in his opinion, the pilot's opinion, the agent's intervention would prove disastrous. I don't know how all that got communicated, but apparently it was.
I could shed some light on that, actually. So when the pilot was taking off, there was some consternation about like, hey, we're gonna leave here. And the pilot basically was able to signal to the tower with whatever methods were available at the time, transponder, radio codes, something or other. I don't know what that looked like exactly in the 70s. I kind of have an idea today. But they signaled to the tower that they were in trouble when they took off. And once they got airborne, they're like, we're going to need fuel. They went to go to this airport in Jacksonville, Florida. And somewhere in there, knowing that the plane had been hijacked, that's kind of how the FBI gets involved.
Eventually, the hijacker lets the co-pilot and then also the associate. And where the associate falls between hijacker and bystander, it gets a little sus.
Yeah. So that goes down kind of like this. The pilot's saying, hey, we're here for gas. The FBI at this point has gone to the control tower where the plane is landing and saying, like, we're not giving you gas. And the pilot's saying, like, we need gas. Like, this guy's got a gun. He's serious. Like, we got to go, right? And the FBI is kind of taking this, like, firm stance. Nope. We're not giving you gas. You need to go park over here, turn your engines off, or else. And
I'm picturing the FBI guys from Die Hard. Yeah, the guys in the helicopter.
Yeah. And so this is kind of the start of the standoff where they were only landing for gas, and they also were asking for things like flotation devices and stuff to get to this Bahamas flight in case of an emergency, that sort of thing. They were going to have to go overseas now, over water. They wanted flotation devices, gas, and they needed to some equipment to start their engine. I don't know. It was the 70s, whatever.
Yeah. And at some point, the hijacker claims to have 12.5 pounds of explosives on board.
Right. So where this turns into sort of an event, right? And these are some important details. Is the FBI is like, turn off your engines. You're not going anywhere. And the pilot, who's under duress, right? He's being held hostage, is like, you don't understand. And that sort of discrepancy where the FBI is kind of stonewalling this and saying, like, you're not going anywhere, right? We're not giving you the gas, is where a big part of the crux of this story comes into play when it comes to hostage situations and crisis negotiations, which is where we're going.
Yeah. So the FBI guys detain the co-pilot and the associate who went to go barter for the fuel or negotiate for the fuel. And then the FBI guys use a rifle to shoot the plane's engine. And when that doesn't quite work, they try to shoot out the tires, which was a recurring tactic that we saw in several of these Havana events. And as the shooting happens, the hijacker shoots and kills his wife, the pilot, and ultimately himself. So
Predictably.
Yeah. And I never want to make light of a very meaningful thing in the hostage rescue world, but I think it's important to point out when we survari the Vitases and when we don't. And this is a failure, right? When the hostages die, we didn't do the thing we set out to do. That's mission failure, period. Right?
So, to get into some of the nuances in this story. So, what ends up happening, the FBI takes this stance of like, what we're not, I hate to use the trite term, we don't negotiate with terrorists. That's going to come up later. But essentially, like, no, we're not giving you nothing, right? So the co-pilot had exited. The associate had exited. That left the pilot, the main hostage taker, and his wife still on board. And in that situation, they refused to kind of go any further with discussions, with negotiations for fuel, etc. And what ended up happening was the main FBI agent who was in charge, this O'Connor guy, went ahead and like walked on up to the aircraft like, hey, like, we got your buddy, we got the co-pilot, it's time to come on out. And that's where things didn't go well, right? So that intervention happened 15 minutes after the aircraft landed. Right?
That was quick. It was very efficient. That's what I like to see. I like to see efficiency from the
is
feds.
good. Except that, like, time is money, right? So, the pilot's wife, the pilot is Mr. Downs. His wife is Mrs. Downs. Files suit against the United States saying that, hey, this was a negligent effort to resolve this issue, and essentially is looking for damages based on her husband's wrongful death.
And we know that over the course of history, suing the government for screwing up doing government things has always played out really well, right?
Obviously.
Obviously.
Yeah. That's gone real well. However,
Qualified
it was the 70s.
immunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was the 70s. So this court case, Downs versus the United States, is significant in the world of hostage rescue for domestic law enforcement. And my intent in talking about this case for domestic law enforcement and hostage rescue is to, one, distinguish what a hostage event is. What is a hostage scenario versus some other things, and we'll talk about that. And two, talk about some implications for managing that sort of situation, right? What we have to recognize is that the FBI intervening in this event 15 minutes after the plane landed, tactically, essentially shooting out the tires, shooting out the engine, walking up to the aircraft and saying, come out or else. What we have to recognize is there was actually a lot to work with here. we were actually making some progress. We got the co-pilot off the aircraft. He was telling us some stuff. The accomplice got sent off the aircraft to negotiate to try to get some gas. We're actually going somewhere, and no one actually is dying right this second. So when it comes to what the court case found in Downs versus United States, one of the quotes right out of the case is that we find, furthermore, that O'Connor, who was the special agent in charge, was clearly unreasonable in turning what had been a successful waiting game during which two persons safely left the plane into a shooting match, which left three persons dead. Going on to the investigation itself, again, right out of the court case, Downs versus United States, O'Connor's basic fear was that the airplane would depart with what he had heard was less than 30 minutes of fuel left. He reasoned that the hostages would have had a better chance of surviving an on-the-ground assault than continued flight into the unknown. Yet the plane had made no movement away from its landing berth, and if delay had continued for a while longer, the plane might have run out of fuel while on the ground, thus accomplishing the purpose of the armed assault without provoking an irrational reaction from the hijacker. In addition, the hijacker had said, "Let's get out of here," upon first hearing the no fuel decision, but the pilot had not complied with the request, and the hijacker instead let both the co-pilot and an apparent accomplice leave the plane to bargain for fuel. Thus, the hijacker himself had decided to participate in the waiting game, and there was no reason to suppose that the plane was about to depart when O'Connor ordered the aircraft forcibly disabled.
I really liked the verbiage that the hijacker himself had decided to participate in the waiting game.
Yes.
The enemy gets a vote, and you can literally see the vote, and the fact that the court saw that
Yes.
is noteworthy, right?
So we need to understand in this case that we had something to work with. And that is a key thing that's going to come up in this discussion, right? So this case establishes, number one, law enforcement must have a specialized response capability for special problems. That is one of the things that came up in this. They discussed whether this special agent that was in charge of this assault had ever been exposed to this sort of thing, and if he had experience in dealing with this sort of thing. There was an FBI manual. There were some documents that said, this is how you're supposed to handle it, right? And at the end of the day, what it means is that we have to be ready to deal with this sort of problem. We need a procedure, a method, a doctrine, right? We need something to deal with this, right? Number two, it also establishes that there must be some negotiation effort. There has to be an attempt, when reasonable and practical, to do something other than storm the castle. And the way this is described in this court case is that waiting game, right? The plane was going to run out of gas eventually. It would have been stuck on the tarmac. And rather than like storming the castle, going up there and forcing the shooting, if these people were engaging in some sort of exchange that meant negotiation of some form, we got to go with that, right? And it's to recognize that a tactical resolution, that storming the castle, is the last resort. It's not something that we do because we're just impatient. It's not something that we do just because we're a hard ass, right? It's not like a show of strength or will that we do just because. It's a last resort. Now, at the end of the day, in this case, a lot of it had to do with qualified immunity and whether or not the government was acting within the realm of their discretion. And in some ways, that was found to be the case. But regardless of the outcome of that, it highlights that due attention will be placed on the perceived incompetence or inexperience to these sort of responses, to this kind of event, right? That we have to be able to develop the capacity to handle this sort of thing professionally. Is it a shit show? Yes. Is it difficult? Yes. But we still have to be able to manage it. So, taking that a few steps further, if we were to call this a hostage situation, right? Because we're trying to apply this to the future events that might come up. What is a hostage situation? A hostage situation, if you were to look at sort of the criteria for that sort of thing, there are 3 elements to that. The first is there's got to be a hostage, right? There has to be a person. If I'm a bad guy and I'm like, I'm going to kill my wife and I've got a gun, I'm going to do it. But the hostage ain't there. The wife ain't there, right? That's not a hostage scenario. He's threatening the person. He has the ability to do it, but the person is not available for him to carry out his harm. So hostage criteria number 1, there must be an actual victim or hostage. Number 2, they have to illustrate that intent. So my wife is here with me and I'm going to kill them. Where this becomes a situation is in scenarios where, let's say, I'm a bad guy. I don't want to go to jail. My wife or girlfriend or whatever is in my apartment or house with me, and I'm not coming out. That person inside is not necessarily a hostage just because they're a person that's inside with me. I might say, hey, I'm not going to prison. I'm not going back to prison. I'm going to kill a cop if I do, right? If you try. A person inside is not necessarily a hostage unless I can demonstrate that there is some hostile intent towards the people that he has access to. And that brings us to the third piece of criteria, which is the present ability to do it. If I say I'm going to shoot somebody, but I don't have a gun, that's not the same thing, right? Number 1, there must be a hostage or a victim. Number 2, there must be some demonstrated or stated hostile intent towards the victim. And there must be a present ability to carry out whatever threats that they're saying they're going to do. Those 3 things.
So sometimes this is really straightforward, and in movies and TV shows, it's often very straightforward, but often in real life, it's not. Are there actually humans? Are they alive? Are they held against their will? That sounds easy, but for example, how many American hostages are being held by Hamas right now as we record this? Ooh, that's a tough one. Are they still alive? Are they under 100 tons of rubble? We don't really know. This is a matter of tactical intelligence and evaluating your sources. Same with the claim, I have 12.5 pounds of explosives. Do you? In this case, I don't think the guy did.
And that's part of the ability piece, right? Does he actually, like, I'm going to blow the world up?
Cool.
Are you though? Right.
Roger.
And like that's the thing, right? Is you have to make some assessment of it. Does he possess that ability?
And it has to be more than a wild ass guess, right? And that's where intelligence comes in. You have to collect on the guy. And consider your sources, right? Like you have what your eyes are telling you, whatever you see when you arrive at the scene. Maybe you have what the bad guy is telling you if you've made contact. That doesn't mean he's telling you the truth. And then you have all the other sources and methods to sort this out. You need to do that quickly because it drives the rest of your decision tree. It drives your algorithm. If you figure out right away, yes, there are hostages. Yes, they're alive. Yes, they're in danger. Yes, he has real capability and intent to harm them. Yes, he has some condition or demand. The more information you can get, the quicker. And the more high credibility information you can get, the quicker, the better this whole thing's going to go. It's an information game.
Yes. So with that, what we have to differentiate in a hostage scenario from is this a criminal barricade, right? Where the guy's in there by himself and he's just trying to not get caught or not get arrested. We might call that a bad guy in a box. Bad guy in a box, pretty easy problem to deal with, right? I have some authority to arrest him. I have criminal charges. They're serious. I don't have to play fair, right?
I have an abundance of tear gas.
Now, where this becomes difficult is when there are people in the house or the home or building with the guy or gal who are not hostages, right? But are potentially willing or unwilling participants of some form. In other words,
and particularly children, right? There's a kid in the room.
Kids.
He hasn't indicated that he wants to harm the kid, but gosh darn, that complicates my situation, right?
Yeah. I mean, the kids is an easy one, right? But it could be the girlfriend. The girlfriend is a good one that, like, hey, he's not saying he's going to harm the girlfriend, but she's in there with him, and that changes our approach to things. That doesn't make her a hostage. It does change the approach. I can only be so aggressive and use so much force on, like, the girlfriend in the room with him than if she was being labeled as a hostage. So, like, words mean things, right? And this is where that criteria comes in. The intent, the ability, and the presence of an actual person. So we have to be able to decide that. And I could tell you, I've been on several of these kind of calls where we went from, is he holding her against her will or not? Well, she had a chance to leave, but she didn't. And so we're not going to call her a hostage. Versus, well, she had a chance to leave. She's trying to talk him down, but he's still threatening to kill her. Kind of still a hostage, right? Like, there's a lot of gray in all of that. And that's part of the calculus that you have to deal with. The other thing that you have to differentiate between when you deal with hostage situations is this like an active killer or exigent circumstance? So if you're sitting there and you're like, maybe this is a hostage scenario, maybe not, I don't know, barricade, and there's like gunfire, but you know there's people inside and he's shooting, well, that might be more active shooter type, that ongoing loss of life, the potential for people to die, right? Stop the killing, stop the dying. That is the mission of active killer response. So if there is ongoing loss of life, then you probably need to intervene. That might not mean wait for SWAT. That might mean you have to go. And that includes situations where someone has been shot and they are now maybe bleeding out. Like maybe they're not dead, but they're going to die if you don't intervene. It might also include situations where this starts as a hostage scenario, but someone in there is diabetic or having chest pain or a heart problem, right? Like something that if you don't intervene, again, someone is going to die potentially. And this is where you have to apply a lot of critical thinking, right? Like, what about those scenarios where, like, he's not killing anybody, but he's repeatedly raping this girl? At what point do you say, no, we're not going to let that continue to occur, right? You've got to intervene. What about, like, ongoing physical harm? He's tearing the fingernails off of these people. Are you going to let that continue? Some physical harm where it's like, well, they're not going to die, so we're just cool with it? At what point do you have an obligation to make that stop? This is a difficult question to answer, but it is one that you need to wrap your head around in this kind of scenario.
It's a much more difficult question to answer if you don't have good eyeballs on the situation.
Yeah. Yeah,
right?
There's a lot of maybes.
Intel drives this very intensely. Yeah. The higher confidence you have that this is happening and he's not just putting on a show for you, the more this is going to drive actual decisions, right? One thing I want to highlight between the possible scenarios here, barricade, hostage situation, active killer, is it can bounce quite suddenly from one to the other to the other. And one of the classics recently, of course, was the Uvalde, Texas event, right? Where it went from being an active shooter to still an active shooter to what was treated as a barricaded criminal.
Criminal barricade. Yep.
Where there were people still bleeding, still dying, potentially hostages, and ineffective response.
And that's the thing, right? Is like, you have to like, this is where critical thinking is such a big deal. When people think active killer, they think active gunfire. Or at least active stabbing, active something, right? But you have to consider that if people are bleeding out, there are victims left untreated. There is some duty or moral obligation to act. It's hard, and like the thing is, to Jim's point, on the intelligence end, you're like, is that what's happening? Because we don't know. That's the hard part. That's the thing, right? That's the thing about this.
Yeah, and fog and friction will eat your fucking lunch,
yeah,
right?
It's not clear cut. It's not just black and white.
And so going back to strategy, when you're trying to decide what to put resources into, do you put them into 500 more rounds, or do you put them into sophisticated, say, cameras, microphones, technical intelligence capabilities? And similarly with my people, do I have someone on the team whose job is to put the picture together? Right? Am I just, I understand that SWAT teams vary from agency to agency. Sometimes it's like 5 deputies. That's what you got. You go to the range as often as you can. You practice clearing rooms. You serve warrants. Cool. But consider that if you're it, maybe one of those deputies needs to be focused very hard on how do we build out the picture, the intel focus, right?
Yeah. So the key here is you have to be able to differentiate, right? You have hostage scenario, criminal barricade, the exigency or active killer type of response, where that might not just mean the typical active killer thing, right? The exigency can also be a medical emergency, physical harm or torture, sexual assault. Part of what helps define that is the access to victims or additional victims, and recognizing what the failure to act could involve, right? Another thing that we have to differentiate between is just straight up terrorism. So when we talk about hostage situations, usually what we mean is people who are using a hostage to leverage someone or some entity to act or not act in some way. That could mean, hey, I'm trying to get to the Bahamas, so I need fuel, life preservers, and a starter for my plane, as in the case of USV Downs. It could be to, I want to get away, I want to escape, I want to not get in trouble, right? It could be to facilitate some other act, perhaps, that's more sophisticated that we don't completely understand, right? It could be to be left alone, right? Like, I don't want to go to jail today, or I'm stuck in a corner, right? Like that sort of leverage, having a hostage for leverage is different than if I have a hostage that I'm just going to use to make a point. And this is where the idea of doom captives comes into play.
Yeah. So I beat up the concept of intel, but it's going to be a recurring theme. If there is a terrorism nexus, and terrorism sometimes is Islamist, Al Qaeda, ISIS, whatever. Sometimes it spans the spectrum of ideology. But consider the possibility, are they just using the hostages as human shields while they conduct an operational act? Are they using them as human shields in order to facilitate an escape? Are they just waiting for the media to arrive so that they can detonate themselves? And that's the kind of thing you're trying to figure it out, and you got to figure it out quickly, right? As far as doomed captives, the phrase "the hostages are already dead" is one way of looking at this problem set in order to kind of simplify your philosophical approach to it. If you consider that as soon as a hostage is taken, they are effectively dead, and you're trying to bring them back, that might drive how you build your decision tree. That's how I look at doomed hostages. Mike, how do you look at it?
The main thing in terms of problem solving, right? You're trying to save lives. If your mission, and that's always the goal, right? To save lives. Salvare vitas. If that is your goal, and you're looking at it from that angle, and you recognize that, hey, these guys or gals, the hostage takers, are not trying to leverage these people for some action. They are only going to try to make a point, to sensationalize their efforts, to gain media attention. In that sort of scenario, the more time that you give them, the more successful they will be. So on the tactical resolution side of it, if I go, all right, I recognize that these people are just going to take as many people as they can take. So the sooner I go, the sooner I take action before they fortify their positions, before they plant their explosives, before they chain the doors, before they do all these other things, then the more successful I will be in saving the most people possible. And you need to understand that if someone is using hostages for leverage, that losing the hostages costs them something. So take a step back and try to get into the minds of the hostage takers and figure out what they're trying to accomplish. If they just want to make a media sensation, be famous on YouTube, that's one thing. If they're trying to get away or make demands or not go to jail, that's another. So you have to recognize the difference between those two things. Because in one case, swift action might save more lives. So all that being said, how do you manage this kind of problem? You're dealing with a potential hostage sort of scenario, and you're trying to differentiate between a hostage situation, big deal, versus a criminal barricade, not that big of a deal. Bad guy in a box, sad guy in a box, suicidal. Like he's suicidal, but no one else is in danger. Okay, could deal with that. Or a active killer kind of exigency. Hey, if I don't act, people are going to die. Bigger deal scenario, right? If you think about the concept of active killer exigency, it's very easy to say, stop the killing, stop the dying. If I don't act now, someone is going to not live. Okay? Fair enough. If you are trying to differentiate between a criminal barricade and a hostage scenario, then you can start with contain, isolate, evacuate, communicate. That is kind of the doctrinal law enforcement solution. And this is actually the solution or the doctrine that got active killer response in trouble. If you think like pre-Columbine, they treated active killer response like this: contain, isolate, evacuate, communicate, and people just kept dying and no one did anything. And that was problematic, right? So you have to make sure you distinguish those two things. Now, if you say, all right, this is more of like a hostage scenario or a barricade scenario where no one is currently dying, we have some time to work with, what do we do next? Contain the problem, Make sure that it is in a defined area. Isolate the bad guy. The bad guy in a box goes a long way. Evacuate the people around him or her to make sure that they are the only people in danger. And then try to work on communicating with people, particularly the bad guy. So contain, isolate, evacuate, communicate is a good strategy for your criminal barricade hostage type of scenarios. Now, where you need to put some time and effort and attention to is, what are your contingencies? In a hostage scenario, what's the worst case problem? The worst case is they start taking out hostages and you got to go. Now it becomes active killer. They've got access to innocent victims. There's ongoing threat or loss of life, right? And you've got to do something to stop that. And so you have to do an emergency assault. You have to be prepared for the what ifs, and that's your contingency planning. If I have to go right now, what does that look like? What bodies do I have? What resources do I have available? And how am I going to do it, right? Versus a deliberate assault where, all right, I've got a crisis team. They're available to do this kind of unexpected, unintended emergency assault. In the meantime, if I'm going to do this on my terms, what does that look like? Maybe that's building explosive charges. Maybe that's doing rehearsals. Maybe that is making sure I have enough bodies or people available. Maybe that's using the intelligence that I've gathered to leverage where I'm going to go on that kind of assault, right? There's all kinds of things that go into the contingencies. One of those contingencies that I have to think carefully about is, what is more important? Establishing containment, the bad guy in a box, keeping him in one spot, versus establishing a crisis team, which is the ability to respond if he starts doing something differently, like carrying out violence, attacking people. I would argue that in a criminal barricade, you should probably focus on containment versus a hostage scenario, crisis entry, emergency assault. That's a much bigger deal. So take some time to consider which is your priority. When the first people start getting on scene, when the first resources are available, which of those two things is a priority? Do I care about being able to go inside, or do I care about containing this problem? One of the foundational philosophies when it comes to law enforcement tactics is time, and then talk, and then tactics.
And don't forget tear gas. That's my favorite T.
That's the favorite. It's part of tactics, right? Tear gas is part of tactics. Time, talk, tear gas, and tactics.
Yeah, like if I can less lethal before I shoot him in the face, that's probably preferable, right? Most people are going to live if you tear gas them. Neat little history thing. This is probably 15 years ago now. There was a big theater in Russia where there were hostages, and the Russians pumped it full of, it wasn't tear gas, it was like an anesthetic gas. Killed about half the hostages, but they did end up killing all the hostage takers. So
the most Russian thing I've heard.
Yeah, the doomed hostages. Well, they saved half of them. It was pretty good. With enough vodka, it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the worst that could happen? Okay. So another way of managing these kinds of problems, one is plan for contingencies, right? Contain, isolate, evacuate, communicate, plan for contingencies, time, talk, tear gas, tactics. Part of that is recognizing the importance of a public caretaking role. If this person is armed and dangerous and a threat to the public, right? I want to isolate them the best that I can. Pretty straightforward. Right?
Well, and as an example from our original scenario, the plane with only 30 minutes worth of gas, am I going to let it take off just to crash it into the city of Jacksonville? Right. So maybe I do have a responsibility at that point, especially in a post 9/11 world, to make sure that plane doesn't take back off.
Yeah.
And I think nowadays we'd be real cautious about letting planes take off if they are under the control of a terrorist.
Well, and there's kind of a difference, right? Because at the point that the plane was like, hey, we need gas, and they said, we're not giving you gas, they weren't trying to take off and leave. They said, well, let's send people out to talk with them. That's like an important distinction, right? They were trying to get their way. They were trying to use the hostages as leverage. So going back to the management of this kind of thing, right? Time, talk, tear gas, and tactics. Recognize the public caretaking role that we take, and with that comes the priorities of life. The most important lives in a scenario like this are those of the hostages, the victims that we are there to protect and defend. Second to that are the bystanders or innocent civilians that might be in the area exposed to this problem. Third are the officers or operators that are involved in trying to resolve this issue. And last on that list are the suspects or the hostage takers. So if you have identified this problem as a hostage taking type of problem, criminal barricade kind of problem, it is always important to ground your decision making in the priorities of life. So if there is some way to deal with the suspect in a way that ensures the safety of everybody else, that's fine. I can live with that. But the key in there, in the priorities of life, is recognizing that it must ensure the lives of everybody else. If I take action thinking, I'm going to go, this plane landed, 15 minutes later, I'm going to go storm the castle. I'm going to go just walk up to the plane and like, hey, you better come out or else. I better be able to guarantee the safety of everybody else. Downs versus United States illustrates the need to attempt negotiations. And there's this like trite saying that you see in the movies about like how we don't negotiate.
Whoa. We don't negotiate with terrorists.
Obviously, we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? Except that we do.
And it's important to understand why we say we don't, right? As soon as dirtbags get it in their heads that if I take a hostage, it's going to work out for me, a lot more humans get put in a lot more danger. So it's important that, generally speaking, we convince the world that hostage taking will not net you any gains, right?
And that's true, right? And for that sense, we don't negotiate with terrorists, except that we do, right? And part of that negotiation has a lot to do with the threat of a tactical resolution. The tactical options on the table keep pressure on the hostage takers so that they are considering the alternatives. It is to leverage on our behalf, right? That there are things that can help lead us to a better outcome. On our end, on the good guy end, we have to recognize that tactical resolutions, storming the castle, are dangerous, difficult, and often they are unlikely to be totally successful. Someone's probably going to get killed. And maybe it's the bad guy. Fine, whatever. But maybe not. Right? There's no guarantee it will only be the bad guy. So having that leverage and saying like, hey man, if we have to come in there and get you, like, yeah, you might get one of our guys, but one of our guys is probably going to get you. And we're going to send a lot of guys, right? There is some leverage to be had.
The whole time you're dying.
Yeah, there is some leverage to be had in that. So the threat of a tactical resolution is important. And with that is it also buys you time If they're talking, we talk about verbal containment. One of the things that you hear crisis negotiators talking about is verbal containment. If they're talking, they're not killing people. If I can keep them on the phone, if I can keep them engaged, keep them talking to me, what they're not doing is other stuff, right? Planning their other stuff. So verbal containment's a big deal. If I can keep them engaged, I can work with that. As emotionality decreases, rationality increases. So with time, if I can reason with them a little bit, maybe I can help them understand that, like, yeah, you might kill all the hostages, but you're also gonna die. Like, that's not a win for you, dude. You know, maybe there's another way. The other thing that using that time buys us and doing negotiations is it gives us time to get our pieces in place, to do some planning, do some rehearsals, do all the intelligence gathering that might help us be more successful if we do have to go that route.
Yeah. And so when you're considering your intelligence gathering and what you're using that time on, like I said, it's not enough just to get the info. You have to get it quickly enough to matter, right? Going in with critical intelligence requirements. What is it that I'm trying to sort out, right? What do you need to know in order to make an effective rescue? And some of that will change based on the exact scenario and the setting. What information do you need to have an effective negotiation? Because the more information you give the negotiators, the more ammo you give them, probably the more successful that's going to be, right? And in my experience, too often we gather intelligence with a very wide net, hoping to find something that matters. We just look around or we Google the guy's name. Sometimes you need to be extremely targeted. There may be one piece of information that makes or breaks you, and you may need to think about outside the box about how to find that one piece of information. Like, where exactly in the room is he? Is he standing or sitting? Where exactly in the room is the hostage? Is the hostage standing or sitting? And just to kind of give an example, you might consider watching the movie Captain Phillips as far as why that matters.
Yep. So intelligence gathering is a big part of this. Like, even if you don't get to resolution, you might be able to buy yourself little bits and pieces of the puzzle, right? And the other thing to recognize is that negotiations themselves, reasoning with people, right? I mentioned that, like, as emotionality decreases, rationality increases. As you get closer and closer, you can gain a lot from that, right? The steps of crisis negotiations take time. And those steps look something like starting with active listening. Like, crisis negotiators will listen closely to the person to figure out, like, what their hooks and barbs are, what the things are that the people are saying that are that resonate with the person, right? To demonstrate empathy with the person, to build rapport, to gain influence, and to ultimately reach a point of problem solving and behavior change.
So there are good reasons to slow this down, right? Time, talk, tear gas tactics. And generally speaking, you control the clock. He might have the first move. He might have the initiative. But now you have the second move, and you get to decide when and where and how that is, right up until you don't. Because he still has a vote, and he could choose to retake some initiative. For example, start killing hostages. Bang, splat, bang, splat. How many of those are you going to go through before you call the go call, right?
And that's exactly it, right? So if you are waiting for that versus taking an active role and trying to resolve that, right? That's the big difference. And one of the things in Downs versus United States is to understand that we have some obligation or responsibility to try to resolve this another way. And I can tell you a number of cases that I have been involved with where I'm like, man, if we have to try to go on this, it's not going to end well. We really need the negotiators to figure out how to give them something, right? So recognize that. So if you decide, or you're reaching a point where you think you've got to go, there is a risk versus reward calculus that has to happen. Part of that is your likelihood of success. I was talking with a group of people about this recently, and they were like, well, you might not get to choose the guys, like you don't get to pick your team, right? It might just be like random patrol cops. Hopefully they're good, but maybe they're not. It's not going to be a team full of SWAT guys that you get to go with. On the flip side, having a random group of people versus a well-trained, coordinated group of people to go do this thing might change the whole metric of, can I do this or not, right? So there's a lot of well-intended hard chargers out there who will make the assertion in the aftermath of stuff like this, when they read about it or they watch videos, they're like, oh, well, they should have done this, or like they should have gone. They should have. Okay, that's fine. But in terms of a tactical resolution, is it necessary to have the people who are not only aggressive and willing to do it, but also who are capable? And there are several cases I can think of where people would insist that we should go. Well, yeah, you should. It's not going to go well, though. And I am, for one, very critical of events like Parkland, Uvalde, those sorts of things. But when you think about like the competence that a lot of cops have when it comes to like breaching doors and windows and those sorts of things, it is harder than it looks in a lot of cases. And it is part of the metric that you have to consider when you're like, can we actually do this in a way that would make a difference?
So most, I think, police officers, and maybe I'm wrong on this, have shot through a police window, a car window at some point in their training. Yes or no?
I would like to think that they probably have, but for a lot, it's like maybe they did it once back in the day and don't remember much. What about
SWAT? Like a typical SWAT guy at some point has shot through a window?
I would hope
some
so.
idea.
I would hope so, yeah. Okay.
What about an airplane window?
Yeah, it's different.
And it's one thing to shoot out a Cessna
bus
window.
Windows are different. Train windows are different. Like, yeah.
Yeah, an inch of Lexan is a whole different ball game than that. So just consider that, like, this problem, the tubular assault problem, might sound easy when you're looking at the diagram, and it's a different ball game when you actually go like tap on the window and you're like, shit.
Yeah. Yeah. It's different for sure.
Yeah.
And like, if you understand that intuitively, it's like easy to take a step back and be like, no, but a lot of people don't think about that, right? And that's the experience problem. So if you think about like the undertaking in front of you and like, do we go, do we not go? You have to recognize like this is an away game and there's a lot of risk that we have to mitigate and there's a lot of unknowns. And it's not just the operators. This is the part that about hostage rescue that makes it really difficult. Is it's not just about risking our own lives. It's also about like, can we actually save the people? Or should we wait and see if there's another way? And that's the hard part. So if you are able to gain the intelligence that show us where the people are, or to gain some separation, or to gain some surprise and initiative, those things help. Some examples. I can think of just a couple examples from my line of work specifically that we were able to sneak someone out of a bedroom window. It was like an apartment building. The hostage taker was in the front room. We could see him through a window, kind of hiding, avoiding us. And we were able to put a ladder up against that window and sneak people out of the bedroom. If we wait until the person gets exhausted and they fall asleep, that's one that we used one time. There was a guy was holding a kid hostage. He fell asleep, and we were able to take advantage of that. There was another case where we were able to wait until the guy started responding to other things that we were doing that made him like separate from the victim, and we could see through a camera. And so it made his actions predictable. And we're like, all right, maybe we do X, he does Y, and then we do our assault, right? So if you're deciding, like, should I do this thing? You have to account for what's the risk versus reward. Is the juice worth the squeeze? And all that stuff has to like play into it.
And this is the advanced level of operational risk management, right? You are picking between bad outcomes and likelihood and severity and doing whatever you can to cheat. You're trying to dial down the severity of things going wrong or the likelihood of things going wrong. This is also a cool area where deception and distraction are your friends. We can't give all the recipes to all the secret sauces on a podcast, and we don't want to inform the dirt bags. But consider anything you can do that gets him looking the wrong way or standing in a window or muffling the sound of your approach or to draw his attention off of you is probably a good thing. There was a train rescue back in the day, probably in the 70s, in the Netherlands, where they did a low pass with jet fighters right before they did the hit. And it got everyone looking one way, and the assaulters came from the other way, right? During the breach. It could be as simple as that. It could be as simple as a flashbang if the flashbang is used appropriately in the right place, the right time.
Yep. So, again, going back to the goal of this, which is to differentiate between what is a hostage-taking scenario, active killer scenario, criminal barricade. The active killer scenario, I think a lot of people are set up in their minds to think about like ongoing active loss of life, access to victims. Pretty straightforward, right? If you think about like a hostage scenario turned active killer scenario, that's important. You have to be able to like flip that switch. Things changed. We were waiting, but now we can't wait. And especially where you have to be careful about that distinction is when you're getting set up on all this. Situations unfolding, sounds like kind of a hostage scenario or a barricade scenario with a unknown third party inside. I don't really know. Okay. What are your priorities? Contain, isolate, evacuate, communicate. Cool. What if? And you might not be able to wait for assets to arrive, right? If it becomes an active killer kind of scenario where like suddenly you hear screaming and gunfire, right? Like where is your line in the sand where you're like, I gotta go. We have to go. You should be constantly asking yourself and the people around you in the midst of this sort of problem where those lines in the sand are. If you are a patrol officer and you show up to a run-of-the-mill 911 call, unknown trouble, you have to keep these opposing ideas in your head and go back and forth. Is this active killer? Is this hostage situation? Is this criminal barricade? Is this something else? Right? Am I being too comfortable or too risk averse? Is someone going to get hurt or killed by me just sitting here and waiting? Do I have time to think about this stuff, or do I need to go? These are not easy decisions. It's never clear cut. This is the sort of thing that you bring all of your training and all of your experience and all of your mental preparation to bear to make. The decision that Mike today would make is not the same thing that Mike yesterday would have made. And you have to bring all of that and sit there and consider, like, am I doing the right thing here? Is this really the right call? And that comes with personal risk, sometimes physically, sometimes just like from a leadership standpoint. Like, am I going to send other people to their death if I do this? It's a big deal, right? And for that reason, it's worth tabletopping these ideas, both just hypothetically, like, hey guys, what if this happened? What do you guys think about this? And in debriefs, okay, X, Y, and Z happened. This is what we did. How did we feel about that? Cool. What if this were the case? Throw some what ifs in there, right? And even in the moment, there might be a time and place where you go like, all right, we have a second to think about this. What do you guys think? This is what I'm thinking. What are you thinking? Right? There might be that purpose of it, like a tactical pause where you go, shit, this is bad. What do you guys think about X, Y, or Z? And at the end of the day, you need to remember that you are supposed to be the professional. You are the one who is supposed to be able to figure this shit out. And you don't get to pick the day.
I like the word tabletop that you used. Usually when we think SWAT shit, we think about going through the shoot house or breaching the door, serving the big warrant. A lot of crisis readiness comes from exercising all the other stuff, the stuff that isn't shooting the guy in the face. Consider doing a command team exercise where you sit down all the key leaders in the agency and the community and talk them through how you're going to handle the crisis and what you expect from them, and bring in stakeholders from other agencies. Do a next level of detail tabletop exercise with the command staff, the negotiators, the fire department, the EMS guys, and rehearse the concept of any given scenario, right? Talk through decision points and options as your team sees them. Do a dry walkthrough scenario, just of the scenario. You can have blue guns, inert guns, just to try to find the friction points, and walk through again with the medics, with the EMS guys, with senior agency leaders, so that everyone has like a common picture of how you're going to handle an airplane, or how you're going to handle a bus, or how you're going to handle an apartment or a house. And as for preparing for that day, you know, you have every day from this day to that to prepare. It might be useful to spend some time learning those tubes that you might have to assault. If your school district has one model of school bus, you should probably learn that model of school bus. Go get its user manual. If your city just bought a new green energy bus, you should probably spend some time on it and on top of it and under it. If you live in, say, a Southwest Airlines hub in southern Arizona, maybe talk to Southwest Airlines and get a serious walkthrough of one of their 737s. Talk to the pilots, talk to the crew. You might assume the feds will handle a scenario like that, and often, eventually they will, but you own that until the feds show up. Now, if you get real serious about this, maybe you have someone get a pilot's license and learn their way around the local airport. Now, some listeners might scoff this, be like, oh yeah, in my copious free time, I'm going to go learn how to be a Southwest airline pilot. Understand that I get that you are probably wildly understaffed and you are probably wildly overtasked. But if you want to win when the chips are down and do some of that special weapons and tactics stuff, it's not just serving the warrants. It's not just doing the call outs. It's also the preparation and the readiness for when things get weird. And that's the sort of preparation you have to do. I also want you to consider separately, if you're the hostage, right? Our civilian concealed carry crowd, I know you're a concealed carrier, so what are you going to do? You're going to draw your Nina and you're going to put 2 in his forehead. That's cool if there's a him. But what happens when there's 4 of them and they have AKs? You're going to drop all 4 with your micro pistol? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe you decide to leave that, not skin that smoke wagon. Okay. If for whatever reason you or your loved one is taken hostage, consider, breathe, be patient, be a human to them. You don't want to be the faceless, nameless character in their fantasy. You want to be dignified, but not abrasive. So you can talk, but don't maybe go out of your way to engage. And remember, your job is to stay alive, and consider it might take a while, right? Because we just talked about how time matters in this. When the thing gets loud, when the breach happens, consider that there might be some things you could do to improve your survivability. Most of them involve how easy it is to see your hands. Mike, can you speak to, do I want to stand up? Do I want to hit the ground? Do I want to raise my hands real fast? What do I want to do with my hands and my body?
I think most people, generally speaking, people are going to hit the floor and or put their hands up when this sort of thing goes down if they are a good guy, right? And for that reason, at least where I train, our response is usually to tell people to get down, get down, get down. And the people that aren't getting down are usually the people that we need to focus on. So if you are getting down and putting your hands where we can see them, you're probably in a good spot. Now, I speak for my team. I can't speak for every team. But I would like to think that contextually, tactical teams all over do a pretty good job of understanding or recognizing what the good guys will probably do versus what the bad guys are probably going to do. If you're putting your hands where we can see them and you're getting low to the ground and out of the way, that's probably a winning strategy. In terms of things that I want the cops that might be listening to this to take away from the episode, the distinction between a hostage situation and a criminal barricade. Remember, you need those 3 things. An actual hostage, the presence of a victim or hostage. So if I'm saying I'm going to kill my wife and I have a gun, but the wife isn't there, it doesn't matter, right? You need all 3. The presence or access to a victim or hostage, the ability to carry out whatever threats, and that they're actually making threats to harm that person. Not just they exist in the house. I want people to understand that distinction. I also want people to understand that we have a responsibility to consider alternative ways of handling this problem. So, tactical resolution, we all, it seems sexy. It seems like a good idea at the time. But I think any of us that have done this in real life for long enough recognize that the odds of that being successful are actually pretty sketchy. And so we really need to try to find another way, right? So slow things down, use the negotiations to your advantage, and if things go tactical, that's okay. But one of the things that this court case establishes is that you have to make an attempt, right? It is not just your life or the lives of your fellow operators or officers that are at risk. And so get that right.
I think on the cop side, the preparation matters, intelligence matters, and gathering good, high-quality information quickly will simplify your decisions. And it's easy to say and it's hard to do, which means you got to dedicate time, effort, money, people to that part of the problem set. And preparation is more than just your ability to shoot. It's all the other stuff, right? Having good conversations and good relationships with the airport, with the bus station, with the school bus drivers, that kind of thing, I think will improve your odds of success. And that's what we want. We want you to succeed. We want you to survive the Vituses. That's all I got.
All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you. This episode is also brought to you by 09 Holsters. We talk a lot about people, ideas, and hardware on this show, so when we invest in equipment, we always think in terms of experience first. 09 is helping you figure out how to carry the gear you need to be effective. They are built by cops, for cops, with a minimalist design and bomb-proof durability. Radio cases, flashlights, body cameras, even canine remotes, you name it, 09 has been filling a void in tactical duty holsters for more than a decade. Go see what they offer at 09 Holsters, that's ZERO, the number 9, holsters.com. 09, built to win the fight. Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you could find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group. We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.